Old paws remember home, even when homes fall away. We carry each other one careful day.
This podcast concerns a situation that has arisen alongside the large number of South Africans who are planning to leave the country for the United States under the Refugee program, as well as those who have already left. But I want to say clearly from the outset that I believe many of us, are deeply grateful for the opportunity that has been extended by the United States government to South African minority groups to seek safety and refuge. The concern and generosity that have been shown are exceptional, and they are genuinely appreciated. I also want to state that I fully respect the choices individuals make, whether to leave the country or to remain here, whether through standard immigration routes or through the refugee program that has now become visible and accessible. These are deeply personal decisions, often made under conditions of fear, grief, and uncertainty. I want to acknowledge again the exceptional nature of the United States response. This kind of targeted concern has not previously existed. For many people, particularly those who have felt unseen or unsupported for most of their lives, this has resulted in feeling acknowledged and supported for the first time. Now, this is not a political commentary. I leave that to political commentators. It does not endorse any political party, any government, or any ideology, and it does not attack any country, leader, or policy. It is not a polemic. It is not ideological. Rather, as an anthropologist, my purpose is to make social commentary where I see that others have overlooked. And raising this secondary concern does not negate the appreciation which I feel. I want to make that very clear. This podcast is a statement of concern. It is born out of social concern, moral concern, and a concern for animal welfare. It is a humanitarian and animal welfare concern that sits alongside immigration and refugee processes. It arises out of my lived experience and out of a deep and growing concern about a situation that I believe is leading to an animal welfare crisis in our society. I want to be very clear from the outset. This podcast is not based on exhaustive or comprehensive research, and I'm not claiming definitive statistics. What I am doing, instead, is using conservative, transparent assumptions about impact, and I'm doing so without the intention of assigning blame. This podcast addresses a situation that has arisen as a result of the number of people who have already left South Africa for United States, and the many more who are currently planning to do so, primarily through immigration pathways and through the refugee program that has already been made available. I am speaking here as someone with lived experience of displacement and as someone who has kept animals together under extreme circumstances. So my focus is on unintended consequences, not motives. I understand why many people are afraid, given the particular social context in which we live. That fear is not irrational. We live in a society with very high levels of violent crime, however one wishes to describe or analyze that. And I'm not going to debate that here. But what I am saying is that people's fear exists within a real context, and that people have the right to leave if they're given the opportunity. I fully respect the choices individuals make, whether to leave the country or to remain here, whether through standard immigration routes or through the refugee program that has now become visible and accessible. These are deeply personal decisions and often made under conditions of fear, grief, and uncertainty. People are not leaving casually. At the same time, it is important to acknowledge that concerns emerging from sections of the European descent South African community, particularly around safety and perceived threats, have historically received very little attention or acknowledgement. I'm not raising this to inflame tensions, but to explain context. For many, this moment represents the first time they felt seen, heard, or supported in relation to those concerns. In that light, I also want to acknowledge, again, the exceptional nature of the United States' response, because this kind of targeted concern has not historically existed. And for many people, it has created a sense of being recognized, seen, and supported for the first time. But gratitude and concern can coexist. It's possible to be deeply thankful for an opportunity and at the same time to be concerned about the unintended consequences that arise alongside it. So this is not an abstract discussion for me. I have myself been the victim of multiple near-fatal crime incidents, and some of them were violent. They were the result of xenophobic, ethnic, ideological, and racial motives. And in this podcast, I'm deliberately not naming perpetrators, not detailing circumstances, and not blaming any particular group. That's not the purpose here. But what I am saying is that I was physically injured as a result of these incidents, and that I have also been emotionally and psychologically scarred, and that the impact has been lasting. Now, I lived through the 2021 KwaZulu-Natal unrest, and it was during that period that I fully realized how extraordinarily difficult it would be to get animals out of a dangerous situation. What I do want to say, and this is important, is that throughout all of this, I kept my animals with me. My dog stayed with me. I moved repeatedly through temporary accommodation, bed and breakfast, self-catering places, and short-term rentals, and I kept them together. I did everything I could to keep their routines as stable as possible in order to minimize trauma. I made a conscious decision that my family, my dogs, the family that was still with me, would not be broken apart. I know how difficult it is to move with animals. I know how hard it is to find accommodation that will accept them. I know the logistical, emotional, and financial strain of transporting them, keeping them safe, keeping them together, and trying to maintain routine under conditions of stress and instability. So I'm not coming to this discussion without compassion, and I'm not coming to it without knowledge. I know exactly how hard this is. I want to make a distinction here between migrants and refugees and about the practical consequences of being one or the other. Many people are not yet fully aware of the refugee program that exists between the United States and South Africa, although a growing proportion are becoming aware of it, while other people are leaving through more conventional migration routes. Now, these two groups experience time, pressure, and decision making very differently. And that difference has real consequences, particularly for animals. Migrants, generally speaking, have time. They plan. They may sell property, arrange visas, organize finances, and make phased decisions over months or even years. Critically, they often have time to think about their animals. They may rehome dogs, look for alternative accommodation, delay getting another pet, or wait for an elderly animal to pass naturally. Now, these are not easy choices, but they are choices. They are options, imperfect ones, but options. Furthermore, the numbers of European descent immigration from South Africa is a slow but steady trend. This is directly opposed to what is proving to be the case with the USA refugee program from South Africa. Refugees do not have this luxury. Refugee decisions are often made under compressed time frames, fear, urgency, and uncertainty. There is frequently a sense that one must leave now before circumstances deteriorate further. That difference in time framing affects behavior. It affects how decisions are made. It affects whether animals are prioritized or deferred. And it also affects the likelihood that animals are left behind. What concerns me most is what happens to animals in this situation. Dogs are left behind abruptly. People say, often with genuine hope, we'll find good homes. But the reality is that adult animals are difficult to place. And old animals are the hardest of all. These are the most fragile and the hardest hit by being largely abandoned by their once loving families. When people migrate by choice, they usually have time to plan for their animals. When people flee as refugees, animals are often left behind suddenly, surrendered, or pushed into already strained welfare systems, not out of cruelty, but out of fear, urgency, and lack of alternatives. And yes, sometimes out of lack of caring. You hear the same phrase again and again. We'll find good homes for them. But the truth is far harder. Again, it is extremely difficult to find good homes for dogs, especially adult dogs, and even more so for older dogs. That difficulty is compounded in countries already overwhelmed by poverty, unemployment, and severely under-resourced animal welfare systems. At scale, these animals are not being rehomed. Many are abandoned, many starve, many are killed quietly, efficiently, without records, without outrage. This is not about blaming refugees. People fleeing for their lives are not villains. They are victims of circumstances no one chooses. But compassion cannot stop with humans alone. What concerns me is that we're heading toward a crisis, a silent one. A crisis in which tens of thousands of animals are left behind in the shadows of humanitarian emergencies with no international framework to protect them. If we can organize visas, flights, border processing, and resettlement programs, then we can at least begin to ask one essential question: what happens to the animals? Because being forced to flee should not mean condemning another living being to suffering. And right now, that is exactly what is happening, and what is going to happen on a much greater scale. It is important to situate South Africa within the broader global refugee landscape. According to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, South Africa is not recognized as a refugee-producing country within the standard international refugee settlement system. In UNHCR's global data, there are currently no recorded South African refugee populations originating from the country under that framework. This matters because globally, the refugee crisis is at an historic high. As of 2024-2025, more than 42 million people worldwide are formally recognized as refugees or forcibly displaced. Against that backdrop, South Africa occupies an unusual and exceptional position rather than a typical one. As of mid-2025, only a very small number of South Africans have actually been resettled in the United States under the special program. Publicly reported figures indicate that roughly 59 individuals, primarily Afrikaners, arrived on the initial flights earlier this year. Unofficial estimates suggest that the number may now be above 100, though no consolidated or regularly updated official figures have been released. At the same time, there were reports that tens of thousands of South Africans expressed interest when the program was announced. Figures in the region of 60,000 to 70,000 inquiries were often cited. However, these were expressions of interest, not refugee admissions, and they should not be conflated with people who've actually left the country. In practical terms, fewer than 100 South Africans have so far been resettled through this route. So, as we know, there are no publicly available up-to-date official figures for later cohorts in 2025. The US government has not released an ongoing or real-time tally of South African refugee admissions, and reporting remains limited to early arrivals. So while the program is highly visible and symbolically significant, the actual numbers involved at this stage remain very small. This distinction between perception, interest, and realized movement is critical to understanding the wider impacts, including those that fall outside the human sphere. So projecting forward, what sort of numbers are we looking at for the USA South Africa refugee program in the following year? The program operates with capped numbers per fiscal year, accelerated processing, and the prioritization of specific applicants. The maximum figure that has been discussed publicly is up to 7,500 people in a single fiscal year. It is important to be very clear about what that number does and does not mean. This is the maximum number who could leave in that period. To date, only a very small number of people have actually relocated under this program. However, planning, anticipation, and decision-making are already happening at scale. And this matters because the impact on animals does not begin at the point of departure. It begins long before that, when people start preparing to leave. Animals are relinquished early, usually. Usually, in the best scenarios, rehoming is attempted early. Shelters begin to feel pressure early. The consequences precede the movement of people, but with the lightning speed at which people are given plane tickets, after completing the interview process, there leaves little time to find suitable homes for pets or to place them in the best permanent situations. When the program was announced, a large number of South Africans expressed interest. Tens of thousands reportedly contacted the US Embassy. But expressions of interest are not the same as approved refugee relocations, and they should not be confused with actual departures. For the 2026 US fiscal year, the refugee admissions cap has been set at 7,500 people, a historically low figure compared with previous years, when refugee caps were far higher. The US government has indicated that most of these limited places will be allocated to minority South Africans under a special prioritization program. This is controversial, and South African authorities strongly dispute whether this group meets traditional definitions of refugees under international law. It is also important to note that broader US refugee intake from other parts of the world, including countries experiencing war, famine, and mass displacement, is currently paused. In practical terms, this makes the South African program one of the only active refugee channels at the present. In order to better understand the impact of the refugee program on animals, I've attempted to model human numbers and scenarios. Because the actual number of people who may leave is uncertain, I'm not making assertions. I'm simply modeling scenarios in order to understand potential impact. Using conservative assumptions, we can consider three scenarios: a low scenario of 1,000 people, a mid-range scenario of 3,000 people, and an upper scenario of 7,500 people leaving, which represents the maximum often cited. So it's not a prediction, it's an exploration of impact if these numbers were to materialize. People usually do not leave as isolated individuals. They more often leave as households. So using a reasonable average household size of 3.5 people, those scenarios translate roughly as follows. 1,000 people equates to approximately 285 households. 3,000 people equates to approximately 860 households. 7,500 people equates to approximately 2,140 households. Each household represents decisions about animals, whether to keep them, rehome them, surrender them, or leave them behind anyhow. And it is at this household level that the animal welfare consequences begin to unfold. To take this one step further, where the real consequences begin to emerge, when we talk about people leaving, we are usually given numbers as individuals. But animals don't belong to individuals in the abstract. They belong to households. So the first thing we need to do is translate people into families, and then families into animals. If we assume family units of 3 to 4 people as an average, we can begin then to make an educated, transparent estimate of animal impact. This isn't speculation, it is simply following the logic through. Now, let's talk about animals. I'm going to only focus on dogs as an example. I'm explicitly excluding cats, horses, and livestock. Livestock would be relevant since a large number of farmers are, if not actually, then ideologically, included in the numbers of immigrants leaving. I'm also excluding working animals, beyond dogs. Even with these exclusions, the numbers are confronting. So, presenting the assumptions, I will be using an average household size of approximately 3.5 people. Dogs per household would be 2 or 3. Dogs only, remember, cats, horses, and livestock are excluded. So these are impact estimates, not claims of exact numbers. The assumptions are based on rural and semi-rural South African household norms. They are moderate assumptions and not extreme ones. In many South African households, particularly outside dense urban centers, dogs are extremely common. They are kept for companionship and for security. Dogs are not routinely replaced. When they grow old, they accumulate over time. 2 or 3 dogs per household is not an exaggeration. In many cases, it's actually conservative. So, step 1, translating people into households. Using an average household size of 3.5 people, we get the following results. For 1,000 people leaving, this would equal approximately 285 households. For 3,000 people leaving, this would translate as approximately 860 households. For 7,500 people leaving, this would equate as approximately 2,140 households. One household often has multiple animals. So step 2 would be translating households to dogs. Now let's apply the dog numbers, using an average of 2 to 3 dogs per household, and look at what that actually means. With a low scenario of 1,000 people leaving, 285 households at 2 dogs per household equals approximately 570 dogs. At 3 dogs per household, this equals approximately 855 dogs. And that's a range of 570 to 855 dogs. The mid-scenario range of 3,000 people with 860 households, with 2 dogs per household, there would be approximately 1,720 dogs impacted. At 3 dogs per household, there would be approximately 2,580 dogs impacted. Now that gives us a range of between 1,720 to 2,580 dogs. Now with the upper scenario of 7,500 people, looking at 2,140 households, and at 2 dogs per household, this would translate as approximately 4,280 dogs. At 3 dogs per household, this would translate at approximately 7,420 dogs. Now that gives us a range of between 4,280 to 6,420 dogs. Now let that number sit. Let that number sit and let it sink in. Based on verified reporting to date, approximately 400 South Africans have already relocated under the Special Refugee Program. Translated into households, that is roughly 115 families. At 2 to 3 dogs per household, that means that approximately 230 to 345 dogs have already been implicated in this movement, either transported at enormous cost and stress, which is unlikely, relinquished, informally rehomed, or simply left behind. And don't tell me that all of these have been happily homed. How many of these have simply been abandoned whilst their owners have their eyes set upon a new life in the USA? And that is before we reach any large-scale movement. But even these figures are conservative. They underestimates. They do not account for households with 4 or 5 dogs, which are common in areas. They don't account for older dogs, which may be the hardest to rehome, nor for dogs bonded to specific land, people, or children, nor areas with little or no shelter capacity, nor the reality that immigration often happens faster than planned. These figures also assume that finding a good home results in a successful placement, something anyone working in animal welfare knows is often not the case. So even if only half of these animals are successfully rehomed, we are still talking about hundreds to thousands of dogs at risk. Let us look at the reality here. If only a few hundred people leave, we are already talking about hundreds of dogs affected. And we know that thousands of people will take up the offer in 2026 alone. If a few thousand people leave, we are talking about thousands of dogs. If the full cap of 7,500 people is reached, we are plausibly looking at 4,000 to 6,000 dogs. needing to be absorbed, rehomed, or managed in a system that simply does not have the capacity to do so. There's no animal welfare infrastructure in South Africa that can absorb that quietly. And that is why this matters beyond the suffering endured by the dogs left behind. And please remember to extend what I say about dogs in particular to other animals, including cats, domestic pets, horses, livestock, and working animals. Specifically focusing on older dogs and animals bonded to children or strongly bonded to particular adults. Saying that they'll find good homes is standard, but it is not realistic. This phrase is often offered as reassurance to people who actually leave the dogs behind, as self-assurance, to ease the guilt, perhaps ease the worry, and to others concerned about the animals' futures. But it's not grounded in reality. Welfare and animal shelters are literally already bursting with cute puppies. Adult dogs take even longer to place. They are less visually appealing to adopters than puppies, require adjustment, time, and are perceived as known quantities with potential complications. And of course, older dogs just fare far worse. Senior animals are consistently the last to be chosen. Many are passed over repeatedly. When they placed at all, it is often not into a bonded or permanent home, but into any home willing to take them, sometimes temporarily, sometimes conditionally. Rehoming frequently means multiple moves, escalating stress, behavioral deterioration, a home in which they are tolerated and largely ignored. A good home, in shelter language, does not necessarily mean a final home. It often means as a stopgap. For older dogs, each move is not a transition, it is just another loss. The majority of dogs form primary attachment bonds to specific humans, not necessarily to a general household. But, on the other hand, for many animals, especially senior dogs, their family is their entire world. And when that world vanishes, these dogs experience acute separation distress, attachment rupture, searching behaviors such as pacing, vocalizing, waiting at doors or gates, withdrawal and depression-like states, loss of appetite, and profound confusion in older dogs. Dogs bonded to children are particularly affected. They may guard familiar objects, refuse to engage, or remain fixed in places where children last played or slept. Certain breeds, such as Rhodesian Ridgebacks, bond more strongly with particular people. Animals do not process absence as explanation. They experience it as abandonment. This is not anthropomorphism. It is well-documented behavioral science. And crucially, animals remain where they were last loved, metaphorically, if not physically. Mentally, a dog remains in that place and in that moment in which they were abandoned. That moment, the center of their universe disappeared. They wait. Older animals do not move on. They do not reframe loss. They do not understand urgency, visas, or policy. They wait. There's extensive behavioral evidence for this, including long-term kennel depression, shutdown behaviors, refusal to bond again, disengagement from stimulation, particularly in senior animals, stress hormones remain elevated for longer, cognitive decline accelerates, recovery capacity is reduced, many simply do not adapt. When I was a child growing up on the Zambian Copperbelt, I saw this firsthand. My paternal grandmother was an extremely kind and capable woman. She was often used as a place for people to deposit their unwanted animals. At the turn of independence, many European descent people left Zambia, and this is how Simba came to us. Simba was a very old white shepherd. I was about 6 years old when he was dropped off at my grandmother's house, but I remember Simba very well, because even at this age, I could see his sadness and longing. I could see his confusion and his refusal to accept that he had been abandoned. Simba remained with us for several years. He refused to make himself at home, and he would not come into the house. He slept outside, sometimes on the veranda, sometimes not even, waiting. Simba ate to stay alive. Every single day after breakfast, he completed his daily ritual of waiting for his owner. He would walk up the drive, walk out the gate, turn right, and then lie down with his back to the property wall and wait. He waited all day without budging. At sunset, he would pick himself up, walk back into the yard, drink, have supper, and then lie down on our veranda facing the gate to continue his vigil throughout the night until the next morning, when this ritual would begin all over again. I often think that the reason why Simba lived long is because of his perpetual vigil in order that he may not miss the return of his original owner. Stress has direct physiological consequences. Chronic stress causes immune suppression, flare-ups of arthritis, kidney disease, and heart disease, gastrointestinal disorders, weight loss and dehydration, and increased susceptibility to infection. In shelter environments, this is amplified by noise, confinement, unfamiliar smells, loss of routine, constant social disruption. For older dogs, stress is often the tipping point between fragile, stability, and death. They do not fail, their bodies do. Rehoming is not a neutral act, especially for senior animals. Adult dogs are already difficult to place. Senior dogs are statistically the least likely to be adopted. Animals bonded to children or a single caregiver struggle the most. Multiple placements compound trauma. A senior dog does not experience rehoming as a fresh start. It experiences it as loss after loss. And this is why shelters often use language such as failed placement, behavioral decline, quality of life concerns. These phrases frequently mask euthanasia driven by stress, not disease. South Africa's animal welfare organizations are already at breaking point. They are chronically underfunded, overcrowded, reliant on volunteers who are themselves emotionally exhausted, and operating within widespread poverty and high abandonment rates. There is no state funding. There is no safety net. There is only donation fatigue, volunteer burnout, and daily triage. Adding large numbers of surrendered adult and senior animals into the system is not neutral. It is an ethical transfer of burden. In addition, many of the people seeking refugee status would be contributors to animal welfare organizations in South Africa, resulting in a situation in which welfare would be flooded by the animals of refugee families. While this source of essential funding will dwindle as their resource base flees the country. This translates as more animals are held for longer in suboptimal conditions. Fewer resources are available per animal. Triage decisions become harsher. Euthanasia rates rise. This pressure does not stay contained. It spreads through welfare workers forced to make impossible choices, through volunteers carrying grief they did not create, through communities already stretched beyond capacity. The emotional toll on people who euthanize animals, not because they are sick, but because they are broken by loss, is profound. South African animal welfare receives no government funding and survives on donations and volunteer labor. Staff and volunteers already face moral injury, compassion fatigue, and burnout. Increased intake means longer holding periods, fewer resources per animal, and more euthanasia decisions. These systems are not preparing for future crisis. They are absorbing one right now. When families leave and animals are left behind, the cost does not disappear. It is paid quietly by the animals and by the people who must carry the consequences. When animals are abandoned at scale, the impact does not stop at shelters. It spreads into neighborhoods. Neighbors take animals in temporarily and become carers by default. Informal rescue networks absorb animals they were never resourced to carry. People who did not choose this crisis are forced into impossible decisions. This creates a quiet but powerful form of social stress. Communities experience grief, anger, moral distress, emotional exhaustion. Animal suffering becomes a shared burden, one that accumulates over time. Animal welfare crises do not remain contained within animal species. They tend to bleed into social life, creating rising stray populations, public health concerns, conflict within communities, burnout among informal carers. When animals are abandoned, everyone pays. What I'm pointing to here is not always a flaw in individual choices, and it is not necessarily a failure of compassion. It is a systemic blind spot. Humanitarian corridors exist for people. There are policies, pathways, visas, and accelerated processes designed to move human lives to safety. But there are no such corridors for the animals attached to those lives. They are treated as private responsibility, as property, as an afterthought, even when the movement itself is organized, expedited, and state-facilitated. So when families leave under humanitarian or refugee frameworks, the system does not technically fail the animals. It simply never sees them. The cost of that blindness does not disappear. It is displaced onto already strained shelters, overwhelmed volunteers, neighbors pressed into impossible caretaking roles, and onto the animals themselves. Animals remain where they were last loved, metaphorically, if not physically, and they wait. This is the predictable, foreseeable outcome of a system that moves people while leaving the rest behind. Immigration discussions are framed around humans, rights, numbers, geopolitics. Animals fall through every policy gap because they do not vote and they do not speak. Now, I'm going to say again that there's a deep gratitude here for the concern shown, for the generosity extended, and for the opportunity offered by the United States to people seeking safety. Fear explains these choices. No one chooses to flee lightly. But compassion cannot be selective. There is a structural issue here. Animals are dependents. They're not collateral, and the consequences they face are foreseeable. So the ethical question is simple, and it is unavoidable. Can a humanitarian system be considered complete if it safeguards human lives while dependent animals attached to those lives may become subject to predictable yet preventable suffering? I'm not saying people should not flee. I'm not saying refugees are cruel. And I'm not saying animals matter more than humans. I am saying that there is a blind spot here. Dogs don't understand geopolitics. They don't understand visas or borders. They only understand that the people they loved are gone. And they wait. And then there are the people who will not leave without their animals. Even though they may be terrified and desperate, they will stay for their animals. Even though their lives might be in danger, because the animals are not negotiable possessions, they are family. This is significant because it merges animal welfare with a human safety issue. Where no safe pathway exists for animals, some people simply do not go. Animals become anchors of love, but also unintended barriers to escape. This is not stubbornness or sentimentality. It's moral consistency. And this is why animal solutions can also be human safety solutions. This behavior becomes blatantly apparent when considering the behavior of certain pet owners during crises. Research of disaster situations shows that pets influence whether people evacuate at all. Studies of hurricanes and other emergencies have found that a large proportion of non-evacuation decisions are tied directly to concern for animals left behind. For example, in Hurricane Katrina, many people refused evacuation because they could not take their pets with them, and so they stayed in harm's way as a result. Certainly, the human-animal bond is responsible for increased psychological stress if separation is threatened in these disaster situations. The human-animal bond shapes real choices under risk. Disaster science has associated evacuation failure, staying even when advised to leave, with pet ownership because people are unwilling to abandon the bond that they share with their animals. And beyond the immediate crisis behavior, the psychological effects of pet-human separation during displacement are documented to contribute to stress, anxiety, and impaired recovery in owners, showing the public health dimension of pet loss in emergencies. During the early stages of the US South Africa refugee program, an option did materialize to address the question of animals. In the correct anticipation that certain families would not abandon their dogs and other animals, a fantastic, one-of-a-kind, coordinated pet relocation pathway began to take shape alongside the human resettlement process. That option was Operation Pet Lift. Operation Pet Lift emerged as a practical solution to an immediate and foreseeable problem: how to move animals legally, safely, and humanely with their families. It provided structured assistance with microchipping, vaccinations, rabies titer testing, export and import documentation, and travel logistics. For a brief period, this offered families a real pathway to remain intact, humans and animals together. However, that pathway did not become embedded into the refugee process. It remained largely conceptual, external, volunteer-driven, and fragile, and without formal coordination. This animal pathway unfortunately fell away, even as human departures continued and intensified. And so the result was predictable. Families left, and animals remained. International pet relocation is slow, costly, and procedurally demanding. Without a coordinated framework, many families were forced into impossible decisions under extreme time pressure. Operation Pet Lift existed precisely because this gap was obvious from the outset. Its disappearance did not mean the problem was resolved. It meant the burden shifted onto animals, welfare systems, and communities. So this issue was never invisible. It was identified early, and a solution was attempted. But it was not sustained. And when an animal pathway collapses inside a humanitarian process, the harm does not disappear, it simply becomes quieter. Clearly, volunteer initiatives on their own cannot carry structural responsibility indefinitely. Humane holistic migration, which keeps the entire family intact, requires coordination, continuity, and recognition of dependent lives. Operation Pet Lift showed what was possible. For a brief moment, there was a way for families to live with their animals. And when that way disappeared, the animals didn't simply evaporate. They stayed exactly where they were last loved. Fear explains why people leave. How they leave is decided by options available. The generosity shown by the United States has been exceptional and historically unprecedented. Alongside this humanitarian response, however, there is a real and unresolved consequence: the animals. This situation creates a complicated scenario of layered harm. There is the burden carried by people who leave animals behind, even when they believe they've made the only choice available to them. There exists the direct harm to the animals themselves: emotional, psychological, and physical, especially older animals, and those deeply and irrevocably bonded to children and particular people. And there's the strain placed on South Africa's animal welfare systems. Organizations with no government funding, already overwhelmed, now absorbing increased relinquishment from the very communities being displaced. Another group remains largely invisible. These are the people who are desperate to leave, but who will not abandon their animals. They stay, regardless of risk, because their animals are family. This makes the issue not only one of animal welfare, but of human safety. There is a partial solution. A properly supported pet lift scheme could reduce suffering across every layer of this crisis. Coordinated at scale, ideally with government support, it would keep families together, relieve pressure on welfare organizations, and prevent a silent harm that is already unfolding. Compassion does not have to stop at the border, at the airport, and it does not have to stop with humans alone. Dogs remain where they were last loved. Dogs are the ones we leave behind. Dogs don't understand borders. They understand love. They understand loss. They watch you go. They wait forever.
Old pause. Remember home, even when homes fall away. We carry each other one careful day. We walk the road, you stay behind, still watching, still waiting.